Recording in progress.
Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Hello and welcome to this press conference. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with CBC News. With us today, we have remotely the Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, with us from Dubai, Mr. Randy Boissonnault, Mr. Jonathan Wilkinson, and Marcia Ian, from all cabinet ministers. They will make a statement followed by questions. It'll be one question, one follow-up, and make sure I see you if you want to ask a question. Thanks. Ministers?
Thank you so very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's announcement. Bonjour et bienvenue. I'm Marcia Ian, the Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth. Je tiens aussi à vous remercier d'avoir pris le temps d'être avec nous. J'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que nous sommes réunis ici à Ottawa, sur le territoire non cédé du peuple algonquin et Anishinaabe. I am more than honored to be here alongside my cabinet colleagues, Minister Guilbeault, joining us virtually from the International Climate Conference, COP28 in Dubai, and here today with my colleagues, Minister Wilkinson and Minister Boissonnault. It is so good to be here with you. I have to let you know that I have been called to committee this morning, so I will have to leave you shortly. But I really wanted to be here in my capacity as Minister of Youth and as the Vice Chair of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, because I want to relay what some of our advisors have told us. So I quote them. One says, Alex, in my advocacy work, I've met countless youth who are scared and worried about our future in the face of worsening climate change. Another, Milena, says, the climate crisis is one of the most important issues that our generation faces. Yassi says, my generation doesn't deserve the burden of being the last to see the natural beauty of Canada. Thank you so much to Alex and Milena and Yassi for making your voices heard on this issue. Youth across this country are making their voices heard. Young people aren't asking if climate change is real. Young people know it is. It's real, and they want leaders to take action to protect environment, both here in Canada and right around the world. I want everyone to know, every single person watching this to know that the decisive action that we're taking here today is about more than any of us at this press conference. It's about the type of world we want to live in. It's about the type of world we will be leaving to our kids, to our grandkids. It's about doing our part in the global fight to protect our planet and battle climate change. It's about recognizing that we must act now before it's too late. Today's announcement gives us hope and fulfills a promise we made to young people, and that is exactly what we're doing. Aujourd'hui, nous faisons un nouveau pas en avant vers un avenir plus propre. By committing to put a cap on the largest source of pollution in Canada, we're fulfilling our commitment to the generations that come after us, and we're putting in motion what young people want and need us to do. I want to take a moment to thank the passionate young activists across our country. Thank you for raising your voices, for being clear that it cannot be free to pollute, and for reminding us that you're the ones that will inherit this planet. We hear you. I am now more than pleased to invite Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, to deliver remarks, followed by Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and Randy Boissonnault, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Official Languages. As I mentioned off the top, unfortunately, I've been called to committee and I have to leave you now, but it was my honor to be here with you. And gentlemen, I leave it in your hands. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Marcy. It is evening here in Dubai, where I'm joining you from the International Climate Change Conference, COP28. So good morning to everyone in Canada. It is somehow fitting that today's important announcement virtually spans the globe, because it is profoundly important for Canadians at home and for the international community at large. En septembre dernier, j'ai rencontré Jason Brolin, le chef du service d'incendie de West Kelowna, en Colombie-Britannique. Il m'a parlé du traumatisme qu'il a vécu en combattant les énormes incendies de forêt de cet été. Il a dû envoyer ses équipes en plein cœur du danger, se démener pour protéger des maisons et des lieux. Selon lui, il s'agissait d'un incendie qu'on ne voit qu'une fois dans sa vie. Un vrai miracle que tous les membres de son équipe s'en soient sortis sains et saufs. Parce que tragiquement, les incendies de forêt cette année ont fait de nombreuses victimes. Puis le chef Brolin m'a confié que c'était en fait la deuxième fois en quelques années qu'il était confronté à un incendie, et je cite, qu'on ne voit qu'une fois dans une vie. Les défis devant nous sont immenses. Les changements climatiques menacent des collectivités entières partout au pays et dans le monde. Les feux de forêt, 6 fois plus destructeurs que la moyenne des dernières décennies, ont forcé des dizaines de milliers de Canadiens et Canadiennes à quitter leur résidence. Ce n'est pas le seul problème. Il y a les sécheresses dans les prairies, les ouragans plus intenses sur la côte est, et les inondations extrêmes sur la côte ouest, et la fonte du verger des sols dans le nord. D'un océan à l'autre, le Canada se réchauffe 2 fois plus rapidement que la moyenne mondiale, et nous subissons déjà les effets et les coûts de la crise climatique. Et ces coûts, nous les assumons toutes et tous. Ils continueront de grimper tant que les émissions continueront d'augmenter. For more than 7 years now, the Government of Canada has been working with Canadians, with provinces, territories, individual communities, Indigenous peoples, with NGOs and businesses, large and small, to bend the curve on Canada's rising greenhouse gas emissions, and to make good on this country's promise to make real progress on cutting pollution that fuels the global warming crisis, while building a stronger, more resilient, and prosperous economy for the 21st century. Every sector of the economy and every region of the country has a role to play. And all that collective effort is finally paying off. In 2015, Canada was on a path for emissions in 2030 to be 9% higher than they were in 2005. Today, thanks to the work of so many Canadians, we're ahead of our initial 2030 target and firmly on track to meet the target set in our 2030 emissions reduction plan. In fact, today, our government released the first progress report of our 2030 emissions reduction plan. It shows our current path and lays out the measures that are ongoing and underway to get us to 2030 targets. One piece of that comprehensive plan, a promise we took to the Canadian people in the 2021 election, was to put a cap on the amount of pollution from Canada's oil and gas sector and reduce it at a pace and scale needed to reach carbon neutrality in Canada by 2050. Oil and gas is the largest emitting sector in Canada, and unlike almost every other sector of our economy, pollution from the oil and gas sector is still going up. We owe it to Canadians and to the rest of the world to address these emissions, as we owe it to our workers and businesses to ensure that Canada's well-earned reputation for energy innovation remains our strong suit for the 21st century. Aujourd'hui, le gouvernement du Canada annonce un projet de cadre réglementaire qui vise à plafonner et réduire la pollution provenant du secteur du pétrole et du gaz. Nous visons une réduction de la pollution de 35 à 38% sous les niveaux de 2019, tout en s'assurant que le secteur reste concurrentiel dans le marché mondial. Le cadre prévoit une certaine souplesse, mais ce qui compte, c'est que le niveau de pollution diminue. Bien sûr, nous n'avons pas conçu ce cadre réglementaire seul. Il fait suite à de vastes consultations sur ce qui est techniquement réalisable pour réduire la pollution sans nuire à la production. Nous avons eu plus de 100 rencontres, 150 soumissions et reçu 25 000 commentaires dans le cadre de nos consultations. The emissions cap will also establish a pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050, a goal shared by provinces and industry alike. The emissions cap will help unlock kinds of job-creating projects that will guarantee the industry's record profits are used to secure a bright future for our communities and workers. We're excited to continue engaging with labor on this. En termes plus simples, aucun secteur de l'économie ne devrait être autorisé à polluer sans qu'une limite ne lui soit imposée. The oil and gas sector isn't the only one that is asked to contribute. We will finalize regulation in the coming weeks to ensure that 100% of new cars sold in the country are zero-emission vehicles by 2035. We've also published draft regulations to ensure our electrical grid is carbon neutral by 2035. We all know what's required. We have a common goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. The time has come to get into the nitty-gritty of the framework to help inform draft regulations, which we plan to publish by the middle of next year. We look forward to continued engagement to get these details right. Le temps est venu de redoubler d'ambition et de passer à l'action. Notre main-d'œuvre est qualifiée. Les innovateurs du domaine de l'énergie ont fait leurs preuves et ils sont prêts à relever le prochain défi. Les répercussions du changement climatique représentent un danger réel et immédiat qui exige que chaque secteur et chaque région du pays contribue à offrir des solutions concrètes. It is the challenge of our time, but also a great opportunity. Ce que nous annonçons aujourd'hui est historique dans le contexte canadien, mais aussi au niveau international, puisqu'aucun autre producteur de pétrole et de gaz propose de faire comme le Canada. Together, we can build a future that will benefit everyone. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Stephen. We talk a lot about climate change these days for very good reason. The planet is at risk of burning up. The world's top scientists have been measuring it for decades. This is not new news. And people everywhere have seen it in the floods, the wildfires, and the storms. This past summer, we experienced the most destructive forest fire season in Canadian history, by far. It forced the evacuation of tens of thousands of people. It destroyed homes and livelihoods and blanketed our cities and our towns in clouds of smoke, certainly including here in Ottawa. The policy we are announcing today is one of an array of policies that Canada has been putting into place to do what we can to slow and eventually stop the planet from burning up. While climate change is indeed an existential threat to the future of the human race, it is also rapidly transforming the global economy and global finance in ways that are creating enormous economic opportunity for those who approach the transition to a low-carbon future in a thoughtful, determined, and focused manner. In releasing the World Energy Outlook 2023, Dr. Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, stated, and I quote, "The transition to clean energy is happening worldwide, and it's unstoppable. It is not just a question of if, it is just a matter of how soon." The global energy transformation is both an environmental imperative to protect the planet for future generations and an economic opportunity on a scale similar to the Industrial Revolution. Ce dont le Canada a besoin à ce moment de son histoire, c'est d'une stratégie environnementale et économique réfléchie et ambitieuse qui fasse le lien entre tous les éléments, une stratégie qui garantisse la prospérité et des emplois de qualité dans toutes les régions du pays. Il est certain qu'une partie de cette approche consiste à identifier et à développer agressivement les secteurs clés dans lesquels une croissance incroyable sera rendue possible par le passage à un avenir à faible émission de carbone. Areas like critical minerals, hydrogen and hydrogen production technologies, carbon capture, renewable energy, biofuels and biomass, batteries and electric and hydrogen vehicles, and nuclear technology. However, for a major oil and gas producing country like Canada, part of such an effective strategy must also include a thoughtful approach to the long-term competitiveness of Canada's oil and gas sector, a sector that has long been an important source of wealth and good-paying jobs for Canadians. For Canada's oil and gas sector, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a competitiveness issue. As the world moves to reduce emissions generated by the production and the combustion of fossil fuels, oil and gas that is extracted with the lowest production emissions are expected to be in highest demand. This is true for both non-abated, combustion-related uses of oil and gas that will exist in smaller volumes as global demand declines over coming decades, but also for non-combustion applications of fossil fuels like petrochemicals, solvents, waxes, asphalt, carbon graphite, hydrogen, and others that will be continued to be needed in a net zero world. Aggressively reducing production-related emissions early and boldly can provide a significant competitive advantage for the sector and its workers. In recent years, Canada's oil and gas sector has made progress with respect to reducing emission intensity of production. Many leading firms in the sector have committed themselves to net zero by 2050, as have the provinces of Alberta, Newfoundland, Labrador, and British Columbia. However, ensuring long-term competitiveness of Canada's sector requires that it achieve significant and sustained reductions in absolute emissions on a pathway to net zero production by 2050. The Government of Canada has introduced incentives, regulations, and investments to encourage and support the oil and gas sector in this pursuit. This includes carbon pricing, investments in the Strategic Innovation Fund and the Clean Fuels Fund, and investment tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration and for the production of low-carbon hydrogen. Today, we are releasing the framework for Canada's emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. This cap is a key part of decarbonizing the sector on a path to net zero by 2050. It is critical to sustaining the competitiveness of Canada's industry over the coming decades. Le gouvernement du Canada a déclaré il mettra en place un plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier au rythme et à l'échelle nécessaire pour atteindre l'objectif d'être carbone neutre d'ici 2050. Il fixera une cible pour 2030 qui garantit que les niveaux de réduction sont ambitieux et réalisables et qu'un tel plafond ne réduirait pas les niveaux de production d'une manière qui ne soit pas liée à la base de la demande mondiale de pétrole et de gaz. Today, we are delivering on all three of these commitments in releasing the consultative framework. In designing the cap, we focused on three steps. We worked with experts and industry to determine what emissions reductions would be technically achievable for the sector to achieve by 2030. We then looked at what more could be done beyond what is technically achievable to enable the oil and gas sector to go further in terms of in the short term via the use of compliance flexibility such as domestic offsets. And finally, we examined projected global demand for oil and gas. The scenario we chose is the Canada Energy Regulator's Canada Net Zero scenario. This scenario assumes a path where virtually the entire developed world, including Canada, will achieve net zero by 2050. After taking all of these factors into account, we are proposing to set the cap level at 35 to 38% below 2019 levels in 2030. This is an important part of Canada achieving its goal of a 40 to 45% reduction across the economy by 2030. We certainly intend to consult on this approach in the coming months. A thoughtful and aggressive plan aimed at reducing carbon emissions in the oil and gas sector on a path to net zero by 2050 will help to secure the long-term competitiveness of the industry while creating well-paying jobs. The cap itself, along with other federal initiatives, will drive the need for thousands of skilled workers to build and operate decarbonization technology and infrastructure projects. And we're already seeing this happen across Canada. Dow Chemicals announced its decision last week to invest over $11 billion to build the first ever net zero petrochemical facility just outside of Edmonton. In Saskatchewan, energy workers are applying their skills and expertise at the world's first horizontal well for geothermal power. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the skills and expertise of oil and gas workers are being used by Brea Fuels, which is converting its refinery to produce renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. In BC, Svante is developing a novel low-cost point-source carbon capture technology for use at industrial sites and is constructing a CCUS Centre of Excellence with support from the federal government. And certainly plans for CCUS deployment in the oil sands will drive many thousands of construction and operational jobs for decades to come. By way of closing, it is up to us as a country to make smart choices. We can choose to lead by recognizing where the world is heading and aggressively pursuing decarbonization and diversification initiatives to enable major areas of economic opportunity. Or we can bury our heads in the sand, pretend that the world is not moving rapidly towards a cleaner, greener future, eroding our competitiveness and our long-term prosperity. This is the approach chosen by Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada. The Conservative leader is one of those politicians who doesn't want to tell you his climate plan, because his plan is to allow the planet to continue to warm. His party had decades to offer a plan to slow global warming, and they never do. They did not do it during the 10 years of Stephen Harper when Pierre Poilievre was a cabinet minister, and they are not doing it now. It is time to recognize this for what it is. They'd prefer to let pollution increase, the planet to burn more quickly, so that some people can make more money in the short term. The choice to put this policy forward is a choice to do what we can, to try what we must, to stop the planet from facing ever greater harm. The Conservative plan is to oppose each and every idea that can help slow warming because of a misguided sense of what's important and a misunderstanding of what the economy of the future will look like. Mais en réalité, la science du changement climatique est claire. Sa cause principale est les émissions de gaz à effet de serre provenant de la production et la combustion du pétrole et du gaz. Pendant les prochaines 30 années de transition et après 2050, les pays qui produisent des hydrocarbures extrêmement peu polluants vont promouvoir leur compétitivité. This federal government's focus on decarbonizing Canada's oil and gas sector is both a plan to protect the planet for future generations and to enhance the short and long-term competitiveness of the industry. Folks, for both environmental and economic imperatives, we simply must choose to lead, and today, this federal government is.
Well, thanks very much, Jonathan. Bonjour tout le monde. J'aimerais commencer en remerciant ministre Guilbeault et ministre Wilkinson pour leur travail acharné sur ce dossier. Ça a pris des années pour arriver à une bonne place. Donc, merci, chers collègues, de votre travail. I want to say, as Alberta's minister in the federal cabinet, thank you to Jonathan and to Stephen for their hard work and their team's hard work with partners in Alberta and across the country for getting to what is really a historic day today. And much good work has gone into this policy. And I'm going to go straight to the heart of the matter. Some people are going to try to raise anxiety among oil and gas workers, their families, literally my neighbors in Alberta on this issue. And that's why I want to emphasize something that both Stephen and Jonathan said. What we're talking about today is about cutting emissions. This is not about capping production. Et si je peux le dire clairement en français, pour clarifier, ce plafonnement vise à réduire les émissions. Il ne s'agit pas d'un plafonnement de production. And you're also going to hear people say that this is an attack on the oil and gas sector, and by extension on Alberta. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I can share that with the fact that our government has been working hard for years, hand in hand with industry leaders in our province, with partners, Indigenous peoples, to ensure that we can both grow our economy and protect the environment. Why do we need to do that? Well, we have to stay competitive in a global energy market that more and more demands low emissions. And I know, as Jonathan and Stephen alluded to, that we've lived through dramatic increases in severe weather events over the last several years. I couldn't go out Monday of the long weekend of May or September in Edmonton because the air quality index was 11.5. 11 plus, actually. And so for people who are now having to stay in their homes during forest fire season when they're raging because they simply can't breathe the air, that is a cue to all of us that we have to do better, and that includes the oil and gas sector. So heat domes, atmospheric rivers, forest fires, smoke-filled days, and devastating floods. And even in the middle of COVID, folks, the number one thing that people in Edmonton Centre asked me to work on was fighting climate change in the middle of COVID. And when I'm on the doors still now, that's what they're asking us to do. It's still the number one issue. A majority of Albertans want us to do this, and certainly a majority of people in Edmonton Centre want us to do this. And so for the safety of our communities and our families, we need to address the threat of climate change. Now, at the same time, many of us have a family member, a friend, or a neighbor who works in oil and gas. And these jobs are important, and we're going to protect workers. Our climate goals are completely aligned with growing our industry and building an economy that works for everyone. How do we do this? Well, our government over the past few years has unlocked billions of dollars in investment in the economy of today and tomorrow through incentives for carbon capture, utilization and storage, and other emerging technologies. Jonathan mentioned the Dow Chemical investment. $11 billion, 7,000 construction jobs, 500 permanent jobs after that in the Fort Saskatchewan area of Edmonton. But we can add to that. We've got Air Products building the largest net zero hydrogen plant in Northeast Edmonton. We've got Heidelberg Materials that's going to produce the first net zero cement plant in the world by burying their carbon in a CCUS, by putting their carbon in a CCUS stack. We are third in the world in foreign direct investment right now. What does that mean? Thousands and thousands of good-paying jobs for workers from coast to coast to coast. These are good-paying, long-term, middle-class jobs. And that attraction of billions of dollars of investment is exactly how we know that the plan is working. Make no mistake, we can do big things in this country, and Alberta workers, and the ingenuity that I see in my province and across the country can continue to lead the way and position us for great things. Ne vous trompez pas, nous pouvons faire de grandes choses ici, des choses ambitieuses ici dans ce pays, et notre province peut continuer à démontrer ses talents et son leadership. And as the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Official Languages, I share a responsibility with Jonathan and with Minister O'Regan on sustainable jobs. There is so much that we're going to be able to do with the sector, with workers, and I can tell you that my focus as the Alberta Minister in Cabinet is to continue working every day with my colleagues on this file. It's a good day for workers, it's a good day for industry, it's a good day for Canada. Merci.
Thank you. Now it's time for questions. As I said, one question, one follow-up. We will do questions in the room and then questions online. If you are online and want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And we'll try to get through as many questions as possible, because the more that people can ask the questions, the better the reporting. The Marika Walsh, Globe and Mail.
Good morning, ministers. Just first of all, on the parts of the cap that apply to emissions in the sectors, your government has chosen not to apply this cap to refineries, which just happen to be in Liberal vote-rich areas like Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, and also Alberta. So how is this not an attack on Alberta and the oil and gas sector in the west part of the country where you don't have seats?
Stephen, do you want to try that? Or?
Yeah, I can give it a first shot. I'm told the sound isn't great, but Marika, as you probably well know, we already have clean fuel standards, which are designed specifically to apply to refineries across the country and to reduce the carbon footprint of these refineries. That's the very essence of the clean fuel standards. And in fact, we looked at whether or not it would make sense to apply the cap to the refineries as well. And the conclusion was that it did not lead to further emission reduction than the ones we're already getting from the clean fuel standard. So there's no point in doing that. What we're trying to get at is reducing emissions. We're not trying to burden the industry with regulations. But the refineries will have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, just not under the cap, under another piece of regulation.
Yeah, just one point. I mean, the line that you're taking in terms of where votes are, I think you might want to take a look. Some of the refineries are in Alberta, where we don't hold a lot of seats. The one in Ontario is in Sarnia, where we don't hold that seat. So I'm not sure that the line that you're seemingly trying to push makes a lot of sense. But
It's not a line I'm pushing. It's a question I'm asking. The clean fuel regulation only requires a 15% cut. That's much lower than the cap. If you want to respond to that, please do. But I would also like to ask as my second question, how much this is estimated to cost industry and compliance costs.
So what we're presenting today is the framework that will lead to the presentation of the draft regulations, which, as I said, we should take place in the middle of 2024. We will have more information to provide in the draft regulations. As you know, when we do regulations, we are required to do a regulatory impact assessment statement that specifies the cost of putting in place the regulation as well as the benefits. So this will come down the road.
But let's be clear, there are compliance costs, just as there are for other sectors in terms of complying. And with the methane regulations, they are a big chunk of the emissions reductions going to 75%. Those are actually relatively inexpensive tons. They're a little bit more expensive than the 45%. And the Pathways folks have put out estimates in terms of what they think the costs associated with their investments in CCUS are going to be. That's one of the other big chunks of reductions under the cap.
Marika, if I can on this, I think Pathways was out last week saying they've already invested about $1.8 billion in positioning for this and other reductions. And I met with representatives of Pathways, and they were keen to see what this was going to be. But they've been part of this. I mean, part of the reason we're here today and not a year ago is because Jonathan and Stephen sat down at the table with Pathways, and we shared data sets. Like, we actually got into the real numbers together to make sure that this was achievable and realistic, because we're not going to get to net zero without Alberta industry, Alberta workers, and the Alberta government being part of this plan. And look, we were out first. I think it was the 22 budget where we did CCUS, billions of dollars. And we've been waiting for the Alberta government just last week to finally come to the table and say how they're going to stack with us on CCUS. Industry's been waiting, but they can't make investments unless they can crunch the numbers from both us, the feds, and the province. Now that Premier Smith has come out and said what her government will do, we can have even a clearer picture of the investments that industry will make to reach these targets.
David Aiken, Global.
Good morning. A question for Minister Boissonnault. You sort of anticipated in your comments something Premier Smith has already said, which is this is actually a cap on production. It's not a cap on pollution. I wonder if you could perhaps expand on the idea that this is aimed at pollution, and yet we could see production increase in Alberta, perhaps right through to 2050.
I don't know how I can be more clear about this, David. The Premier's wrong. This is about a cap on pollution and emissions, not a cap on production. Production levels are predicted to go up. We are going to see an increased number of drilling in 24. That's already on the books. Canada has what the world wants. The world changed after Russia invaded Ukraine. The world needs more Canadian energy. And I can tell you what we're trying to do with the most innovative sector in this country, which is the oil and gas sector, which is get to the greenest barrel of oil on the planet. Because the greenest barrel of oil on the planet is the one that the world's going to want first and most. And the smartest people in the world in this are Canadian and Albertan engineers and technicians and workers. And this is about saying to the world, think about it, we're the first heavy producer of oil and gas that's putting an emissions cap in place. That is something we committed to. The Prime Minister committed to having this framework released before Christmas, before the end of the year. We're doing that. And so the Premier's off base. This is about reducing emissions, not putting a cap on production.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just follow up. So I agree with what Randy said, but what I would also say is if you look at the forecast, production increases through 2030, and yet you see significant reductions in emissions. So what Premier Smith says is not true. But over time, we do expect global demand for oil and gas to peak and go down. The International Energy Agency said that will happen by the end of this decade. At the end of the day, if we're converting transportation to electric or hydrogen, and we're converting buildings to use heat pumps and electric heat, eventually you're going to see a decline in global production. And the best way for Alberta and other producing provinces in this country to maintain competitiveness in that market is to have the lowest carbon intensity barrels of oil and the lowest carbon intensity gas. And so that's the point around competitiveness, is this is in the long-term interest of the industry. And I think if you talk to many in industry, they will tell you exactly that.
Thank you. And Minister Wilkinson, maybe this is for you. I'm going to repeat a question that was asked in the technical briefing, and it's about the choice to go with a cap-and-trade system rather than sharply increased carbon pricing. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on why the choice was made for C&T rather than just ramp up the price of carbon.
Well, I think Stephen may want to comment on that, but I'll just say one thing, which is it gives you a lot more certainty. A cap gives you a lot more certainty about the reductions than an increasing carbon price. And our view is that the sector actually has to play a role, just like every sector of the economy, to reduce emissions in line with our objective and the world's objective to achieve net zero by 2050. So, Stephen?
I agree with you, Jonathan.
C'est clair d'abord.
Merci. Ma question s'adresse au ministre Guilbeault. Monsieur Wilkinson, vous pouvez aussi compléter. Pourquoi vous avez choisi d'attendre jusqu'à 2030 avant d'imposer vraiment le plafond sur le secteur du gaz et du pétrole? Comment est-ce que vous pouvez justifier ça à un public qui trouve peut-être que ça vient un peu tard et qui pourraient trouver que vous avez, comme l'a mentionné le ministre Boissonneau, trop écouté les lobbyistes de l'Alliance Nouvelle Voie, les lobbyistes du pétrole sur le timeline?
D'abord, on doit toujours, en tant que régulateur responsable, donner l'opportunité aux secteurs qui sont réglementés de pouvoir faire les transformations qui sont nécessaires. C'est vrai pour le code du plafonnement sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, mais on le fait pour les plastiques également, pour l'élimination des anneaux plastiques, par exemple, pour les canettes de liqueur ou les canettes de bière. Il fallait donner aux brasseurs canadiens le temps de faire les investissements, de convertir leurs usines. Je prends l'exemple de la BAT, par exemple, qui a fait ça. Ça a pris à peu près 1 an et demi, donc on peut pas simplement, ça se fait pas par magie, le déploiement de ces technologies-là, ça se fait pas en claquant des doigts. Et la réglementation va s'appliquer à partir de 2026. Mais comme c'est le cas, par exemple, dans le système québécois de plafonnement et d'échange ou celui de l'Europe, il y a une période excusez-moi, j'ai le terme en anglais, compliance, respect de la réglementation qui doit être mise en place. C'est une période de 3-4 ans. Et rappelez-vous que nos objectifs sont pour 2030. Alors, grâce à la vie du plafond sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, c'est un autre outil qui nous permet d'atteindre nos objectifs, qui nous donne confiance que nous allons pouvoir atteindre nos objectifs de 2030.
Oui, c'est clair que nous avons déjà commencé avec le méthane. Nous avons mis en place une réglementation et nous allons atteindre la réduction d'ici 2025. Mais bien sûr, les entreprises, comme Stephen a dit, doit avoir le temps pour mettre en place les projets, quelques grands projets pour réduire les gaz à effet de serre. Et bien sûr, c'est important qu'ils ont le temps pour faire ça.
Vous me parlez des cibles de
Et
2000.
si vous me permettez, j'ajouterais que, regardez avec l'électricité, par exemple, pour un réseau électrique carboneux d'ici 2035, on a donné 12 ans d'avis aux compagnies d'électricité, aux sociétés publiques et privées d'électricité pour se préparer à la mise en place de ce règlement-là. Ça commence le 1er janvier 2035. Bien entendu, on ne peut pas atteindre le 1er janvier 2035 si on veut faire nos investissements. Même chose du côté de la règle du règlement zéro émission. On veut atteindre 20% des ventes en 2026, 60% en 2030 et 100% en 2035. Alors, c'est très, très, très conséquent avec les autres éléments de réglementation que nous avons fait en matière de lutte au changement climatique au Canada.
Concernant la cible de 2030, pourquoi vous ne demandez pas à l'industrie du pétrole et du gaz de faire le même effort que le reste de la société, c'est-à-dire 40% de réduction par rapport à 2005? Je comprends que vous parlez beaucoup des réductions par rapport à 2019, mais vos fonctionnaires nous ont dit que c'était que de 16 à 20% de réduction par rapport à 2005, là, ce que vous annoncez aujourd'hui. Donc, on fait 2 fois moins d'efforts dans le secteur du pétrole et du gaz. Comment on peut comprendre ça?
En fait, si vous regardez le plan de réduction d'émissions que nous avons déposé en 2022 ou la mise à jour qu'on a fait aujourd'hui qui a été déposée à la Chambre des communes, vous verrez que on peut pas prendre une approche mur à mur et ne pas tenir compte de la réalité des différents secteurs. Alors, il y a des secteurs où il y a des réductions d'émissions qui sont plus importantes et plus accélérées parce que la technologie est là, parce que les investissements sont là. Il y a d'autres secteurs où c'est très difficile de réduire les émissions. Regardez le secteur de l'agriculture, il y a très peu d'efforts en matière de réduction d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre qui sont faits dans le secteur de l'agriculture parce qu'on parle de 200 000 entreprises agricoles au Canada. On comprend que ça va prendre du temps. Il y a beaucoup de travail à faire pour arriver à des réductions d'émissions importantes dans ce secteur-là. Donc, ça peut pas être une approche mur à mur pour chaque secteur. Il faut regarder la réalité de chaque secteur et mettre en place des mesures pour chacun de ces secteurs-là. Mais comme Jonathan le disait, on a déjà un règlement pour réduire le méthane d'au moins 45% d'ici 2025 pour le secteur du pétrole et du gaz, qu'on va augmenter à 75% d'ici 2030. On a déjà la norme sur les carburants propres pour les raffineries. On a déjà la tarification carbone. Donc, on met en place plusieurs mesures qui s'adressent à différents secteurs, mais notamment celui du pétrole et du gaz.
Okay. Mia Rabson, Canadian Press.
You said yourself that the industry knows they have to do this, that it's about their very survival, but they're saying that they don't need the stick approach, that they would prefer, and they're pointing to the United States where they say it's only an incentive approach using the IRA. Why do we need to have a cap if the industry knows that they need to do this?
Well, I would say, first of all, if that's what the industry has said, it's actually not the case. The Americans have methane regulations. They also have clean electricity regulations. They're not actually very dissimilar to our regulations. And as I said, under the cap, the biggest chunk of emissions actually come from reductions of methane. So I think it's important that you have a balance, that you have incentives to assist the sector in making the reductions, and that's true for other sectors as well. But you also have to have a forcing function to ensure that companies are moving in the right direction. We have put into place an investment tax credit for CCUS. We have supported a whole range of projects through other mechanisms. But we also are putting into place a cap effectively as a backstop to ensure that companies are actually making the progress that they need to make, that we need to make in our fight against climate change.
And given the timing of this, if we're not looking at draft regulations until middle of next year, final regulations sometime in 2025, how confident are you that if there is not an election, at least until the 2025, that this will happen? I mean, if an election happens before, it looks like this won't go through. So is there a big risk that this doesn't actually happen?
Well, maybe I'll start, but Stephen may want to have something to say about that. Well, look, I mean, there is a risk in the context of Canada's fight against climate change. And I would say that risk is Pierre Poilievre. At the end of the day, he has had almost nothing to say about climate change since he was elected. And to be honest, he was a member of Stephen Harper's cabinet when Stephen Harper's cabinet did nothing to address the climate issue. I was in the clean technology sector. I was a CEO. I mean, there was despair across the country that Canada was so far out of the conversation on climate. So is there a risk? Yeah, that's Pierre Poilievre, and that's something that Canadians are going to have to assess and evaluate in the context of the choice that they will have to make in the next election. Stephen?
Again, I entirely agree with my friend. I mean, it's not.
It's amazing an environment minister and a resources minister agreeing so much.
But more seriously, Jonathan is right. I mean, it's not just the cap that is at risk. The Conservative Party of Canada and Pierre Poilievre don't seem to be willing or able or capable to understand that pollution kills people in Canada, that pollution makes our kids sicker in Canada. And what's Pierre Poilievre's response to that? I'm going to make pollution free again. I'm going to make it so that companies can pollute as much as they want. It's going to make our health costs go up. It's going to make the impacts of climate change affect more people. It's going to be more costly for Canadians. I was on a panel yesterday here on climate adaptation. The cost of the impacts of climate change in the last decade in Canada has gone up 10 times, from an average of $200 million per year to $2 billion per year. And it's going to continue going up unless we do something about it. And unfortunately, Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada are not the people to do that.
Mia, if I can, you take a look at the numbers. There's a majority of Albertans now that want serious action on climate change. They've actually been calling for an emissions cap because people in Alberta get it. Like the sector has to do better. And members of Pathways have ambitious targets as well. And as I said in my remarks, we don't get to net zero as a country without the sector, without these workers. And I can anticipate that Premier Smith will be unhappy and that we'll have similar grumbling from Premier Moe. But when you add Premier Moe and Premier Smith to Pierre Poilievre, you've got a whole group of Conservative leaders that simply want to take us backward. And the economic advantage that Canada has by greening this sector and decoupling emissions from growth is a really significant opportunity. And if you think about it, we are like 1,000th of the global population as Canada, and we're third in the world for foreign direct investment, after the United States and after Brazil is us. And if you want to be really nerdy and divide it by per capita, we are leading the world right now in foreign direct investment. Why is that? Because we've sent a very clear signal to the world that we want to lead in the net zero economy today and tomorrow.
Okay, the
And
next
if I
question.
can add, Mia, and I promise it'll be the last thing, but I think I read somewhere this week that the representative from Pathways Alliance said, and I quote, they were mystified by Premier Smith's response to our methane regulations because it's the same target as Alberta. We're proposing to continue working the way we've done with them. The companies say they can do this, and the Premier says, no, it can't be done. Oil companies are saying that it can be done.
Okay. We've got 5 people still on the list, and before the ministers have to leave, I'd like to try to get as many questions asked and answered as possible. Next question, David Thurton, CBC.
But why take that risk? I mean, the IPCC, the UN has said we're already warmed to 1.2 degrees. We're so close to 1.5. You could bring in these regulations quicker, sooner than 2026. Why not do this sooner? Why take that risk? Are you basically gambling with the future of this planet?
No, I mean, what we are saying is there are going to have to be very significant reductions by 2030. But David, if you step back, as I said before, the bulk of the reductions are in emissions reductions of CO2 in the oil sands, much of which is driven by CCUS projects. And the other is the implementation of more aggressive methane technology implementation. Both of those require time. Both of those require time, especially the CCUS projects. Like, there is a long cycle planning phase for large scale industrial projects that takes time before you can do it. So you could try to say to them, do it in 2 years, but it's physically impossible. And we've gone through the assessment of exactly what is required to actually put these things in place. So certainly we are going to be looking for progress between now and 2030, but the kinds of reductions that we are looking to see in the oil and gas sector do require some time. Just as in the auto sector, getting to the point where auto manufacturers are in a position to provide the market with sufficient numbers of vehicles to be able to meet the electric vehicle mandate takes time. You have to build factories. You actually have to build electric vehicle infrastructure. It's not dissimilar. It's the same thing with the electricity regulations, where you've got to build electricity generation and transmission. You can't do that overnight. So yes, there is urgency. Of course there is urgency. And you see that in what we are requiring of the sector by 2030. But you also have to be realistic. There's no point in actually doing something, saying something, and putting something in place that simply can't be done.
And I would add to what Jonathan said that we're a federation in Canada. We have a duty to consult Indigenous nations. We have a duty to consult provinces and territories. We have processes in place to consult Canadians when it comes to impact assessment of many of these projects, whether these are provincial or federal. So again, as I said earlier, like these are, and Jonathan said so himself, these are projects that take time, and our timeline on the cap is not very different than what we're doing on electricity or on transportation.
How can you be so sure this won't survive a constitutional challenge?
Well, Stephen, you want to start?
Yeah, the 2001 Supreme Court's decision on carbon pricing made it very clear that the federal government has a role to play when it comes to fighting climate change. And that's what we're doing. As I have said, as Jonathan has said, as Randy has said, we're not going after production, we're going after pollution. And that's what the Supreme Court has said. The Supreme Court said that our ability to intervene on climate change issues is not an open bar, and we can't impede on provincial jurisdiction, and that's not what we're doing now. We are staying in our lane, if you wish, which is the lane of pollution.
Everyone's answer? Okay, Kevin Gallagher, CTV.
Who will approve which carbon offsets are appropriate? Will there be sort of a second body that will say, okay, this much forest or this hydroelectric, how will that system work?
Stephen, you maybe want to take that.
Well, what would happen is that the federal government would develop protocols for these things to be certified, and normally you will have third-party verification of these projects, whether it's in Canada or internationally. The methodology is being developed under the United Nations for these projects. This is one of the things we're talking about here in Dubai. So there is a well-established procedures to do that. It's been done before in Canada. Some provinces have their own protocols. We've started developing some at the federal level. The US have them, European Union, and many other jurisdictions around the world.
I'm sure environmental groups will criticize the amount that this plan depends on carbon capture and storage. What's your response?
Well, it's a portion. I wouldn't overemphasize the amount to which it actually relies on carbon capture and storage, but there is a significant chunk in the oil sands that actually relies on carbon capture and storage. This cap, as I said, is effectively a backstop and a forcing function. The companies that operate in the oil sands will need to make these reductions. They believe that they can do that through the implementation of carbon capture and sequestration. I would tell you there is a lot of work going on around the world in many, many projects that use carbon capture and sequestration. I know that there are some environmental groups that have some skepticism about it. I would just tell you that the technology, the basic technology, has been around for a long time. It's not very novel, and building it at scale is increasingly something that folks are able to do. So I am quite confident that the companies will be able to do this, but ultimately it's up to them, and they are making the bet that this will actually work. And I think they're probably right, but ultimately it's on them.
Okay, ministers, I've got 3 people left on the list, iPolitics, Toronto Star, and Québécois. Are you able to take those questions? If you
Sure.
have to leave, tell me now.
Stephen, do you have?
Okay.
Okay.
David Legree, iPolitics.
Thanks very much. Minister Guilbeault, you were originally hoping that this announcement would have come many months ago. And now that we're finally here, I'm wondering if you could tell us what the sticking points were and how they became unstuck.
I suppose I'm responsible in many ways. I always want to go as fast as we can, and this is one time where we couldn't go too fast. As Minister of the Environment, it would have been possible for me to simply go to draft regulations, to CG1 right away, and start the work and start the consultations. We deliberately decided not to do that because we're doing something that has never been done in this country and that no one else on the planet has done. So we felt we needed to take the time to do it right. We started with a white paper in the summer of 2022. We had, as I said, more than 100 meetings since then, 150 submissions, 25,000 comments on it. We're moving forward with this framework now, which will lead to the draft regulations. It is taking some time, but it needs to be done right. There's no point in doing regulations that won't help us to achieve our goals, whether they're environmental goals or economic goals. And we're pursuing these goals at the same time. We need to be able to do both. If we can't, then we will fail. And that's why taking a bit more time was the responsible thing to do.
So we're expecting draft regs next year and the final version coming in 2025. Given the culture of delays that generally face your government's climate policies as identified by the Environment Commissioner, why should anyone expect those dates to be met?
I profoundly disagree with this characterization. For the zero-emission vehicle mandate, we tabled draft regulations before Christmas last year. And we will, as I said in my speech earlier, we will have final regulation before the end of the year. That's 1 year for these regulations. I challenge you to find a time in our past where we've been able to move so swiftly. Clean electricity regulation, it's going to be about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. We need to be, and we are being more efficient when it comes to deploying our plan. And the fact that our emissions, the projected emissions when we came in 2015 was that we were going to be 9% above our 2005 levels by 2030. We're now 7% below that. Our plan is working, and the emissions are coming down. We need to keep going at it. We're not there yet. And the last thing that the country and the world really needs is Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party, who would bring Canada back to the Stone Age when it comes to fighting climate change, to investing in clean technologies. No one needs that.
And David, I guess I'm somebody who likes data. And I think if you look at the data, at this point, this government and its climate policies are on track to very, very significantly achieve the original target to 2030. We set a 2026 objective. We are actually going to exceed the 2026 objective, and we are on track to actually achieve the 40% reduction that we committed to, which was a significant step up from the 30% that we had committed to before. So the data says our climate plan is working.
Okay, Mark Ramsey, Toronto Star. Quick questions, quick answers, and we can get through the list and send you on your way. Mark Ramsey?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for taking my question. I want to ask, there were a couple challenges doing this. There was, pressure from the provinces and the court decision and the oil and gas industry. What is it that made you take this long? What is it that made this what is most technically achievable? Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to go?
Jonathan,
Sure.
yeah, please, do you want to go
Sure.
ahead? on the
Yeah,
technical
sure.
feasibility?
I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, in terms of the back end of the question around technically achievable, I mean, we spent a lot of time, both internally, but also working with experts and with industry to try to determine what actually could be done within this relatively short time frame that we have until 2030. That's important to ensure that we actually get this right and we're not actually assuming things that just physically can't be achieved. In terms of why it took some time to get to here, I mean, this is a pretty fundamental policy. As Stephen said, we're the first country in the world to do this. And actually, it's been a pretty historic week because the 75% methane reductions was the first country in the world to do that too. And so we wanted to make sure we got this right, and we worked through this. And I mean, to be honest with you, having kind of robust conversations over a period of time it produces better public policy than simply a knee-jerk reaction where you put something into place that may look good. And I would say this is a good piece of public policy that is the result of a lot of conversations internally and externally, certainly lots of discussions between myself and Stephen and our respective teams. And this is a responsible step forward. Simply reacting and putting something out that was not ready would not be a responsible thing to do, and this is a responsible government.
And I would like to add that, I mean, this regulation will lead to emissions reduction of more than a third compared to 2019 levels by 2030. This is massive. This is unheard of in the history of Canada, purely and simply.
I think the other thing, just taking a step back and looking in history, if you take a look at how the Harper government approached building pipelines, which they actually couldn't do because of legal challenges and disagreements with Indigenous communities, lack of consultation, by taking an extra year, let's say, to get this done properly, we've got industry on board, we've got provinces on board, we've made sure that it's technically and actually achievable and that it will meaningfully reduce emissions. And like we're doing this because we want to do the work of reducing emissions, and we also want the sector to do its job to decarbonize so that we have good paying jobs and a healthy economic future for the country. So I think the time we took is to make sure that we're doing the job well. And it's part of the promise of Canada to be a responsible government and do things responsibly, but also to listen to all the parties and be that honest broker to get good things done on behalf of Canadians. And that's what I think what this represents today.
Mark, do you have a
Thank
follow-up?
you. Yes, please. Yeah, through the flexibilities in this proposed cap, what is going to be achieved is going to be still below the 42% target outlined in the emissions reductions plan. And many people, including MPs in your own caucus, warned against, allowing a lower target. What would you say to people who might categorize this as a loophole or by giving the oil and gas companies too much leeway?
First, on the emissions reduction plan, if you go and read it again, you will see that the 42% was based on what we call a backcasting, so a modeling exercise, which is purely looking at the economics of reducing emissions. It doesn't look at technical feasibility, investment that are necessary, the time it takes to do these projects. It was purely economical, and we said very clearly, black and white, in fact, in the emissions reduction plan, that the percentages you saw for different sectors were not targets. They weren't regulated. What we wanted to look at was a direction for what different sectors should do, and we're pretty close with what we're proposing today. And in terms of the flexibility mechanisms, they're limited in terms of scope and volume. And they will also be limited in time. So I think we're taking a very prudent approach with this. I can name you a number of countries who will rely on carbon offset for 30%, 40% of their national emission reduction. We're in a totally different ballpark here. We're being very prudent. We're being very targeted with the use of these mechanisms.
We also looked at very seriously at this whole issue of technical feasibility, technical achievability, to try to ensure how far we could push. But when you actually push beyond that, you actually are getting into the situation where if you're asking to be done something that simply can't be done, then what you're going to do is shut in production and simply send it to other countries. And Canadians would rightly ask us, well, what does that do for the climate if we're actually sending production to the United States or Venezuela? And so the focus is on technically achievable, making a significant step forward between now and 2030 on a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. There, of course, will have to be more reductions in 2035 and 2040 and 2045. But it is important that you found this on what actually can be done and not simply on what you might like to see done.
Okay, une toute dernière question. Question rapide, réponse rapide. Elisabeth Ménard, Québécois.
Oui, bonjour, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui.
Je veux vous parler du GIEC. Donc, le GIEC est très clair là, sur le fait que le captage et le stockage du carbone ne peuvent pas être utilisés pour augmenter la production pétrolière et gazière. J'aimerais savoir comment vous justifiez que c'est exactement ça qui va être fait au Canada.
En fait, deux choses que je voudrais dire. D'abord, le GIEC fait également référence à la technologie de la capture et du stockage du carbone comme une technologie, et là, je vous dis ça de mémoire, mais je pense qu'elle qualifie d'essentielle pour l'atteinte des objectifs de carboneutralité en 2050. Et ce que nous faisons, c'est qu'on ne se sert pas de cette technologie-là. Ce n'est pas la seule chose que nous faisons. Nous avons parlé du méthane, par exemple. Nous avons les objectifs de réduction du méthane pour le secteur du pétrole et du gaz les plus ambitieux de la planète. Et nous sommes le 4e plus grand producteur de pétrole et de gaz. Ce que le Canada fait en matière de lutte au changement climatique, particulièrement dans le pétrole, c'est important pour le Canada, mais c'est important pour la planète en entier. Nous avons déjà adopté un règlement sur le méthane pour 2025. Nous en avons un plus ambitieux pour 2030. Nous avons déjà la norme sur les carburants propres. Pour les raffineries, nous avons déjà la tarification carbone. Donc, le Canada ne regarde pas la technologie de la capture et du stockage comme étant la seule technologie qui va régler tous nos problèmes. Ça fait partie d'un ensemble de solutions que nous mettons de l'avant pour lutter contre les changements climatiques et pour atteindre les objectifs ambitieux de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre.
Elisabeth, as-tu un suivi?
Oui, si je peux me permettre, vous avez eu de très nombreuses rencontres avec l'industrie pétro-gazière dans les 2 dernières années. En fait, en 2022, plus de 8 par jour. J'aimerais savoir, vous avez certainement parlé de ce règlement-là. Quelles étaient les demandes de l'industrie par rapport au règlement et est-ce que vous considérez que le règlement répond à leurs attentes?
Je ne sais pas très bien. Je sais qu'il y a eu des chiffres qui ont circulé. Je ne les ai pas vus, ces chiffres-là. Mais moi, ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que j'ai rencontré les représentants de Pathway à 4 ou 5 reprises, probablement depuis un an et demi. On a rencontré des experts, on a rencontré des ONG sur cette question-là. On a discuté avec les provinces, les territoires. Bien sûr, il fallait parler à l'industrie et on l'a fait parce qu'ils connaissent bien leur secteur. Mais ce règlement-là n'a pas été développé pour faire plaisir à l'industrie. Il a été développé pour s'assurer que le Canada puisse atteindre ses objectifs, pour s'assurer que les entreprises investissent dans la décarbonation, puisqu'elles le font peu jusqu'à maintenant. Alors, c'est une façon de nous assurer qu'ils continuent à avoir des emplois de qualité, que les communautés puissent bénéficier du développement économique qui est associé avec ça, tout en réduisant les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Et c'est exactement ce que le projet de règlement qu'on propose aujourd'hui va faire.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a big announcement. It's a complicated announcement. Thank you for taking all of the questions.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Randy. Sabrina.
Recording stopped.